Good evening, everyone. My name is Gene Moreno. I'm the director of the Art and Research Center of the Institute of Contemporary Art Miami. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the last lecture in our spring 2021 semester, which functioned under the rubric of animating archives. I'm quite certain today we'll close off an amazing trio of lectures. It's been a spectacular semester. I would like to thank our funders, the Knight Foundation in particular, who's really gotten behind us with our digital initiatives and all our work online. And I also want to encourage everyone to keep their eyes peeled as we announce our summer semester, possibly later this week, early next week, but that's already upon us. So tonight we welcome Dr. Ashon Crawley, who's an associate professor of religious studies and African American and African studies at the University of Virginia. He's the author of Blackpentecostal Breath, The Aesthetics of Possibility, which is an investigation of aesthetics and performance's mode of collective social imagination. That was published by Fordham University Press. He is also the author of The Lonely Letters, an exploration of the inner relationship of Blackness, mysticism, quantum mechanics, and love, published by Duke University Press in 2020. It's a book which, by the way, was just awarded the prestigious Lamba Literary Award earlier this month, which Ashon actually received in the middle of one of his seminars. Which is
yes, I did actually. That's right. I forgot.
Congratulations for the award. Dr. Crawley is currently working on a third book, tentatively titled Made Instrument. It is about the role of the Hammond organ in the institutional and historic Black church, in Black sacred practice, and in social life more broadly. All his work is about otherwise possibility. So please, Dr. Crawley, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation and for the introduction. I would like to thank everyone that is here for showing up on a Thursday late evening. As I was saying to my colleagues earlier before you all joined, this is my fourth Zoom of the day. And the first one was 5 hours long, and the second one was an hour. The third one was an hour. And so this is number 4. This is the one. I hope not. Well, this is the one I've been looking forward to all day. So I'm really glad that I can share some work with you all. I'm going to try to keep it to 50 minutes. My goal is to do something in the middle of a kind of lecture-ish talk and like an artist talk. And so my goal is to read one letter from the Lonely Letters, and I read this last week for the folks in the seminar as well. But I'm going to read one of the letters from the Lonely Letters because I think it stages what I think art practice has the capacity to do. And then I'm going to read from an essay that's in a book that is titled Otherwise Revival. This is it's a exhibit catalog for an exhibit that's currently on view at a place called Bridge Projects in Los Angeles. And I am happy and humbled to be able to have two visual pieces in the exhibit, and I have a sound piece in the exhibit, and I have a collaborator, Christina McPhee, and we have a remix of the sonic piece that is in that show as well. And I was able to write an essay for this particular catalog. And the essay, the way that it begins, is in conversation with what I'm going to be reading from the Lonely Letters. And they are both trying to at least give me a way to think about what I think art practice can do and what it means to actually say yes. And so all of these things are about trying to figure out what it means to say yes. And then I'm going to inundate you with a whole bunch of sound and video, like a bunch. Some that you may have seen before if you've joined other things, some that you might not have seen, but this way in a collected fashion. And then after that, I'm going to finish with a small bit of an essay that's titled Lifting Voices in the Key of Blackqueer Yes, because that too is an attempt to explore what does it mean to say yes. And so in the Q&A, if someone reminds me, I'll try to talk about what I think saying yes is saying no to. because I think that these things are sort of co-articulating one another. But yes, as an affirmation is something that's really important for me. And so, again, thank you all for joining. Thanks for the invitation from the ICA Miami. It's really humbling and a pleasure to be with you all again. And so this is from the Lonely Letters. Dear Moth, maybe this will help. I've been rereading Saidiya Hartman, especially Lose Your Mother, and what she stages are a set of angularities, something like an angulation of thought, of black thought, a thought gathered and dispersed from materiality, a thought gathered from dispersed matter. It shows up first, for me at least, in what she recounts as what she first heard in Elmina. The sonic sets off the narrative, is what releases all that is to come. What she recounts, what she heard, what is remembered with sonic force. Obruni. She tells us that Obruni means stranger in the tongue of the folks she encountered, a word and plea and call meant to mark her difference from the ones of the would-be non-stranger. And it got me to thinking, from where does the knowledge of the stranger emerge? One has to have two kinds of knowledge of the familiar and of the strange in order to make a declaration of what is and is not, who is and is not strange, a stranger. From where does such knowledge of the familiar and the strange emerge? What sort of epistemology is grounded in such a call and encounter? It is the knowledge of the unfamiliar now of inhabitation, a knowledge of having known, a knowledge of having desired, such that the word Obruni, to name one as stranger, as strange, perhaps might also produce a counterfactual claim. To make a claim about a black person, yes, even from America, is to make a juxtaposition that is not expected, is to produce angulation, the movement of otherwise space-time. Frederick Douglass knew something about angulation through the pairing of the unexpected. Quote, the slaves selected to go to the great house farm for the monthly allowance for themselves and their fellow slaves were peculiarly enthusiastic. While on their way, they would make the dense old woods for miles around reverberate with their wild songs, revealing at once the highest joys and the deepest sadness. They would compose and sing as they went along, consulting neither time nor tune. The thought that came up came out, if not in word, in the sound, and as frequently in one as in the other. They would sometimes sing the most pathetic sentiment in the most rapturous tone, and the most rapturous sentiment in the most pathetic tone. Into all of their songs, they would manage to weave something of the great house farm. Especially would they do this when leaving home. End quote. They'd sing, he says, the most pathetic sentiment in the most rapturous tone, the most rapturous sentiment in the most pathetic tone. What he recounts, in other words, is the angular nature of black performance, the way it can arrive to us through the unexpected, how the expected and the peculiar form a unique bond, another relationality, otherwise sociality. Black performance not as a series of resolutions and solutions, but the sense of question that angularity makes evident. Such angularity is space-making, is space-time making, is a disruption of the normative space and time of Newtonian physics. Because not only did they walk and march and go to the great house farm, they used sound and song to mark territory with the ephemeral sounds and songs that were improvised. It was all about the moment of encounter with the woods, with the path, with each other. It was all about the moment of performance as the possibility for establishing relation otherwise than what was deemed accepted or acceptable according to Western musical traditions of time, meter, scale, harmonics. Because, and this is important to me, what is the measure of the pathetic and the rapturous in song and sound? This is not a key signature with which we are familiar, and yet one gets a sense of what Douglass meant even if one does not have a particular sound signature in mind. The sentiment produces for us the sentiment produces for us by way of Douglass the sense of question of black key signatures, marked by relation to mood and movement. Anyway, what's so intriguing to me is the pairing of and the doubling of the pairing and the undoing of the doubling of the pairing, rapturous, pathetic, such that any iteration of them is always more than double, always exceeding the limits of Western rationality. What I'm trying to say is, I get this sense in Hartman too. Quote, the African American residents of Elmina had complained that the refurbishment of the castle offended the dead and whitewashed the black man's history by camouflaging the foul character of the place. But the paint was like perfume on a rank body. It exaggerated the stink rather than diminished it. The castle was picturesque in a way that made you cringe, unless, of course, you forgot the cost of its grandeur. And it was easy to forget the slaves crushed under the weight of all that monumentality. End quote. Perhaps the pairing of rapturous with pathetic is about exaggeration, about making real the key signature of enslavement, the sound of the peculiar institution, the sound of violence and ongoing violation, and its afterlife. Hartman here too recounts a similar angularity, a placement of juxtapositions. Here, white paint, violence of terror, such that the aesthetic encounter is one that has to be interrogated. The aesthetic form has to be something that cannot be taken, excuse the phrase, at face value or by merely attending to the surface of things. The angularity of it all, the juxtaposition, opens up the already available disruption to the normative space-time to consider other possibilities. Against the aesthetic, we have to have a preferential option for the anesthetic performance. And so, Adrian Piper again. She has this piece titled Art for the Art World Surface Pattern that I keep coming back to, that I keep thinking about over and over again. She says of it, quote, art for the art world surface pattern surrounds you with the political problems you ignore and rationalizations by which you attempt to avoid them. Art for the art world surface pattern was one of the first of a series of works I did that attempted to confront this depoliticizing or neutralizing effect of the aesthetic stance in contemporary art on the issues raised by minority and other politically concerned artists. My intention was to bombard the viewer with political information concerning various catastrophes and situations around the world, and simultaneously to block recourse to the aestheticizing response by incorporating it satirically onto the work itself. Hence, in order to distance oneself from the work, one would be forced to adopt some critical stance that did not itself express the aestheticizing response. End quote. That the piece had to be constructed in a literal room, in a literal space of inhabitation, is important, of course. What Piper does is spatialize the problem of aesthetic encounter, when it is the grounds for engagement, the way aesthetic becomes a category that is a strategy of containment, a way to racialize and dispense with difference. So back to O'Bruni. Maybe the kids are artists, concerned with politics and catastrophes that are ongoing. Maybe it shows up as the call and encounter enunciated with the sonic force of O'Bruni. Maybe they are announcing an entanglement that Western civil society would have be merely aesthetic, and by naming an aesthetic encounter, a stranger, they are compelling otherwise thought about relation. They produce an angulation of thought, a disruption, a moment of astonishment, a performance of disruptive capacity. A different relation has to be produced when the aesthetic judgment is foregrounded. So perhaps O'Bruni is a concern of aesthetics, one that compels us to consider relationality differently. So the relation perhaps is about the judgment of aesthetics and an anesthetics through the astonishment and exacerbation that can happen. Such an anesthetic force produced through the charge of O'Bruni disrupts Western aesthetics and Western metaphysics. To name as stranger, in other words, is to name through a kind of defamiliarization. But such defamiliarizing does not exhaust the possibility of relation, but rather becomes the occasion, the edge and horizon from which relation must be otherwise considered. It is a metaphorization of knowledge, the metaphorization that is the grounds of knowledge, a distancing that is also about a certain claim of and for knowledge production, a distancing from what has been done toward what can possibly be. Let me know what you think. A. And so that's from the Lonely Letters. And now I'm going to read from this essay again in otherwise revival. And the title of this essay is Otherwise Yes. This is how it begins, actually. Here's another way to begin. My mother got saved, was converted, and born again at the age of 14. A member of the 1968 Barringer High School marching band, my mother told her band teacher the following day. It must have been a Monday. She informed him that because of her conversion experience, she was no longer allowed to wear pants, and thus could not march with the band any longer. The doctrine of her Black Pentecostal congregation had a holiness code of separate and clean living, including no smoking and drinking. And for women and newly converted high school age girls, this also meant no makeup or pants. My mother told this story often at church services when she would stand and testify, or when she would preach. I loved the story as a young person when I was attempting to organize my thoughts around the doctrines and theologies of my own Black Pentecostal church. It then taught me that I would need to be serious about whatever I said I believed. The story of her conviction remains with me today. Conviction. I cannot say that I've graced the doors of a church in recent years, mostly because my practice of black queerness is at odds with lots of congregations regarding sex and sin. But the conviction that my mother talked about is an idea that I carry in me. I attempt to posture my ideological leanings and political thoughts with how I show up in the world as a fleshed, embodied individual. Whatever I say I believe, whether I affirm trans people or the dissident nature of gender and sexuality, or the idea that prisons should not exist and we should abolish incarceration and its logics, I have to daily figure out a way to practice those beliefs in the flesh. A riff on John's Gospel, what is urgent, I find, is a kind of incarnation that makes thought flesh, allowing thought as practice to dwell among us. And then, from the book of James 2, faith without works is dead. Works work on you, in and through you. Works are the signs of breath, of life. This is the practice, the work, the labor of otherwise possibility. The search for and the attempt to enact the various alternatives to the normative that one must believe are possible. And after believing alternatives are possible, one must live such a life in the direction of said conviction. And the prompting for conviction, the kind of which my mother often recounted, happened many times during and emerged from within revival services. I think about the annual New Year's revival, a series of services we would have at the Bible Way Church of God in Christ in our for 7 days leading up to New Year's Day. The revival service in our Black Pentecostal church was supposed to be transformative. We were to arrive to worship with a sense of and for and toward expectation. Revival services were to prompt in us congregants a sense of excitement and desire. These revival services included prayer, lots of praise, and preaching. And most revivals included tarrying, an intense mode of contemplative prayer that was full of noise, hand claps, tambourine shakes, and audible orations, with the hopes of eventually speaking in tongues. And because to tarry literally means to wait, the tarrying during revivals was full of expansive and elaborate prayers taking a long time, anywhere between 30 minutes and 2 hours. The various postures, the prayers, the praise, the expectancy, the waiting, the hope, the intensity of it all were strategies, technologies to create change in the lives of those who would gather. They were utilized to produce conviction, a kind of device upon which change would not only hang, but a device from which change could be inculcated. Can experiencing artwork prompt an interior revival? And can this prompting expose the fault line of categorical distinctions between interior and exterior? And toward what kind of conviction should art establish and allow to unfold in those who experience it? Flesh is created as a set of porous, invulnerable, and permeable capacities. The flesh is open. And so that's all that I will read from that particular essay. And so I want to share some work now, some audiovisual work that is within the sort of thinking, or it's the performative exercises that help me to think about what it means to practice conviction on the one hand, and what it means to say yes on the other hand. To say yes and to practice the conviction that blackness is love and dense and full and free, and to practice the conviction that saying yes to black queerness is joy. And so the first video I'm going to play is just a short sound recounting of saints in a Pentecostal church singing the words yes, which is the sort of primary way that I come to the concept of the word and the phrase yes and yes, Lord.
Let the church say yes. Yes. Oh, come on and ring it out. Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes, Lord.
Okay. That is, his name was Bishop Gilbert Earl Patterson, and he was pastor of a Pentecostal congregation in Memphis, Tennessee. And as you heard them sing, they were singing the words yes and the words yes, Lord, which is this chant that people in Black Pentecostal churches, particularly, but certainly not only, and in the Church of God, particularly, but certainly not only, sing as a mode of affirmation and as a mode of praise. And so that singing that song growing up as a young person is one of the first times that I recognized that surrender, release, openness, porosity, vulnerability is not something that you should contend against, but figure out your relation to. And for me, trying to figure out how does one say yes to Black queerness is another way to say how does one say yes to life? How does one say yes? How does one say yes in a kind of openness? How does one say yes as an ongoing practice? How does one say yes in a world that conspires against those of us that attempt to say yes, that attempts to practice violence and violation against those of us who say yes to a certain modality of living that recognize life as fragile? And so that is the sort of sonic foundation, one might say, of all of the sort of audio-visual work that I try to do, and all of the sort of writing that I try to do as well. And so the writing about conviction, the writing about obruni and angularity, and the writing about queerness that I'll read a little bit of a little bit later, are all emerging from this sort of Pentecostal space that taught me how to cultivate the disposition toward yes. And so what I want to do is I want to play, it's 16 minutes, I apologize, but there's a point to it. There's a film that I sort of am still actively working on that's titled Otherwise Is Not a Place, but a Practice. I'm very interested in how we can practice alternatives, not as a utopia that we can reach or as private property that we can seize or identify with, but as this ongoing restiveness. And in this film, I document a painting practice that I do where I shout or dance on paper or canvas with pigment powder to the rhythm of Black Pentecostal, what's called shouting music or praise break music or the praise break. And so let's watch that.
thank you for coming in the room while we wait upon you. We thank you right now. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, thank you. Thy will be done. Thy name be glorified. Yes, Lord. Hey! Oh, yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Lord, speak through you. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Let him use your tongue. Yes, Lord. Let the Holy Ghost use you.
Hallelujah.
Yes, Lord. Yes, yes. Oh, I surrender. I surrender. I surrender.
This is how we do it. This is how we do it. That lesson off. This is how we do it. This is off. This is how we do it. 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 This is how the legislation do it. Do it. 1001 how.
I said the devil tried to kill me, but I'm not going nowhere. I got to stand. The devil tried to mess with my body, but I'm not going nowhere. The devil tried to mess with my children, maybe incarcerated, but I'm not going nowhere. As long as I live and trouble rise, I'm going to haste unto his throne. I wonder if I got some women that'll open up your mouth and say, Lord, oh Lord, oh Lord, hey.
It's a weary question. I said, homosexual is not a noun. It might be a verb, transitive. It is certainly an adjective, but it is not a noun. To ask the question means you don't know anything about human experience, where it can take you, what it can do. You know, and if you categorize the world in that way, then you lock yourself out from so much. I know boys, I swear to you, sweetheart, I know cats, I'm talking about white cats now, too. Football player types who went on a needle. And who finally died because they're afraid somebody will call them a faggot. But all I know about human life, I don't know much.
Less and less?
Yes, when I was young, I knew a lot. Now I don't know nothing, which is a great relief. But, but all I know about human life is if I love you, I love you. And if I love you and duck it, I die.
Exactly. But then, you see, out of that, I think, is, for me, I see the nature of love. The ability to dare, to challenge despair, and to dare to love. Which
well, you see, you can't prophesy it. You can't say, you cannot make a decision like I'm going to fall in love with,
June
the girl that I marry,
right.
all that Chimpan Alley jazz, right? And the people who reduced you, which is what I mean by my ancestors. I'm a kind of poet, and I come out of a certain place, a certain time, a certain history.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And the people who produce me, whether or not they always loved me or liked me, or
they produced
me because...
And you are the total of
and
that. Mm.
that is my gift.
storm and the rain. What a name. Someone heartache and pain. Oh, I made it. They were trying to push me down, but the Lord blessed me. Round and round. Hallelujah. Thank you, Jesus. I made it. I've been through the storm and the rain. Yeah, I made it. Yeah. Touch my tongue, I made it. Someone heartache and pain. Oh, I made it. They were trying to keep me down, but the Lord blessed me. Round and round. Hallelujah. 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 Thank you.
Jesus. Jesus. Oh, Jesus. 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 Oh, Jesus. Jesus.
What's a faggot?
Stand together to Jesus. Everybody else a Jesus. Come on, side.
A faggot is
Oh, Jesus.
a word used to make gay people feel bad.
Oh, Jesus.
Am I a faggot?
No. You could be gay, but you never let nobody call you no faggot. I mean, unless
How do I know?
you just do. I think.
You know when you know.
You gotta know right now. Not yet.
Oh, Jesus, we need you, Lord. We need you. We acknowledge that we need you, Lord. We confess that we need you, Lord. Jesus. Oh, Jesus.
Come on, why don't you worship him? Amen. Won't y'all invite our guests to move up? Hallelujah. Thank you, Jesus. Come on. Hallelujah. We come to give God praise in this place. At the close of this youth conference, we're looking for the Lord to move. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Why don't you lift your...
That was, well, we can talk about the experimental, what I was trying to do with it was my first experiment in film. And here I talk about the black queer yes. Just looking at the Q&A to make sure I'm okay. Growing up in the doctrinally and religiously conservative world of Black Pentecostalism, we thought and talked and preached and sang about heaven and hell, about rapture and revelation a lot. But the idea of eternal life always made me more than a bit unsettled. When I would think of the idea of eternity, world without end, amen, amen, it would rock my stability and sense of calm. It's hard to describe, but I will try. I would close my eyes and shut them very tightly and try to imagine this unending world. But I would see darkness as expanse in a spiral that had origin but no end. I'd keep trying to think toward this movement, this unending thing, to the point that I'd almost shatter my sense of self and existence. Whatever I thought about this unending thing could not be contained to thought. It would keep happening beyond my ability to think it, overwhelming my senses, beyond them. I think that for many, imagining and saying yes to Black queerness produces a similar kind of existential dread and discomfort. We are finite creatures, everything comes to a kind of end eventually. Endings feel like a curse, but also curiously are comforting. What the Black Queer Yes tells us is this: gender identity and sexual orientation are only ever openings into a possibility against limit, rather than an enclosure on thought and practice, or they should be. The desire for normative biologies and genetics and doctrines and theologies aim ultimately at an end to the possibility of thought, of imagination. So often they are used to tightly shut the mind, like my kid eyes, from thought itself. There is, as so many decades of queer theory and often our own lived experience tells us, no essence of gender identity. This is so unsettling to so many of us because we have been indoctrinated into the idea that gender actually has meaning, that it is a closed case, that there is a natural construction of one's body, and that such natural construction means something in terms of relation between human and the divine, or the relations between humans and other creatures, or relations between humans. Gender is supposed to tell us something about strength and weakness, about intellectual capacity and emotional inclinations, about good and bad, about colors and toys, about shirts and skirts. Why do we allow the idea of gender to produce inclusion and exclusions? Why do we not allow it in sexuality to be the site of an unfolding and flowering possibility? To live in the along, as Gwendolyn Brooks offered, is to say yes. Yes is a poetics, it is a form, a way, a method, a strategy. How does one say yes as a practice? How does one practice an openness and vulnerability and receptivity of the yes? How does one say yes to let yes be such that how does one say yes to let yes be when such a saying yes can lead to existential dread? To say yes to Black queerness would be to allow gender to be an always unsettled question, to be always on the move. To say yes to Black queerness would be to allow for relationalities to emerge and unfold without regard to the bodies that are supposed to allow or disallow such flourishing. In a world of the Black queer yes, our yearnings for relation can be explored with consent and care as the grounding principle. There would be no violence against trans people, there would be no violence against queer people, because we all would be questing for gender as relation. Black Pentecostals sing the words yes and the phrase yes, Lord, during intense moments of fervent worship, ecstasy, praise, chanted at different moments of the church service as the Spirit leads. This chant is a 6-line melody with the word yes and phrase yes, Lord, ascending and descending the musical scale to the keys resolved, only to begin again. Punctuating the chant are hand claps, foot stomps, hollers, moans, pleas, orations, sometimes speaking in tongues, sometimes the quiet, unheard hush of tears streaming down faces, or the buzzing sound of low humming. This song is and is about praise, is and is about worship. It is about surrender. It is about release. The saints of Black Pentecostalism teach me about the gesture, a posture, a release of the saying, yes. In the practice of praise, the saints often throw their hands up, arms raised, hands open. They say this is a demonstration of surrender. The praise in the flesh with hands raised teaches me about welcome, openness, vulnerability, porosity. Can one surrender through and to desire? Can one surrender as a kind of weakness that is not about the antithesis of, and thus an ableist response to, strength? But can one surrender as accepting the vulnerability of existence, a delightfulness in having need and having want? That is what I have been trying to do in the lingering with the word and the phrase yes. And so now I want to play a couple of clips. I've worked on a project that takes a song by a neoclassical musician named Steve Reich. He has this very, very well-known song that was recorded initially 1976, titled "Music for 18 Musicians," and it's an 11. It's a song in 11 movements, and it cycles through 11 chords, and so it's a deeply repetitious thing in a similar way that the saints singing "Yes" and "Yes, Lord" is. And I've taken that Music for 18 Musicians, and I have tried to demonstrate the way that it is a Black Pentecostal song by adding the words yes and the words yes, Lord, with the sound of a Hammond organ to it. If you have headphones, it might be a good time to listen. I can't talk with them on, but it's easier for me to hear it with the headphones on. I'm going to play at first a clip from Music for 18 Musicians, and then I'm going to play a couple of clips from the project that I title Yes, Lord. Okay. And this is from movement 2 of the project titled Yes, Lord. I just want to say real quick that one of the things we discovered while singing this, I knew it by creating it, but that actually singing the words yes over and over again is really actually quite exhausting and very, very, I hope you all can hear me, very, very difficult to do. And I think that the difficulty of the singing it is the intensity with which the difficulty is actually felt in the flesh is not dissimilar from the difficulty of saying yes to the practice and posture of Black queerness, but I think they are both necessary. Because we're running out of time, I'm going to play some from movement 3B and then also movement 11. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. And then this is from, I just want you to hear what movement 11 sounds like, a little bit of it. And then us. I'm rushing through because we're running out of time, but I do want to play about 4 minutes of what ended up being this beautiful, beautiful collaboration between myself and audiovisual artist Christina McPhee, who I met at this kind of random gathering of artists and scholars and writers in London, and I want to say 2017. We were gathered by someone named Angela Last, and it was just this beautiful sort of time of conversation, and I presented works in progress. I think I probably presented from the Lonely Letters at that point, and I hadn't even started like my painting practice at that point, and so we've kept in contact, and she has put a visual register to the sound of music of the Yes Lord project, and we call it Yes Lord Paradise Remix. And so I just want to show you about 4 minutes of that.
Yes, Lord. 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 Yes, Lord.
Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. The last thing I'll show is one visual piece. This is the visual representation of Yes, Lord, that you heard us singing. This is a series this is from a series titled Yes, Surrender, Bloom. And this is a picture, the original picture of the person with their hands raised is Elder Lucy Smith, who was the founder and the pastor of All Nations Pentecostal Church in Chicago, Illinois. It's the first Black congregation to have a radio broadcast, and so they were a very, very well-known church. Elder Lucy Smith was a very, very, very well-known member of Chicago clergy, and they were a Pentecostal congregation. And I love this picture because her hands are in this hands raised posture. It shows to me what it means to say yes. It shows to me what it means to surrender, and it shows to me what it means to bloom. And so in these various registers, whether visual, whether sound work, whether collaborative work, or whether writing work, I've been trying to think about what is the possibility of saying yes. A lot of this was created last year, and last year was difficult for a whole bunch of us. It was very, very difficult for me for a lot of interpersonal or personal reasons, and trying to literally compel myself to still attempt to wake up and say yes in the midst of heartbreak was a difficult thing to do. And so I don't think of the yes that Black queerness calls us to. I don't consider it to be an easy or frivolous thing. I don't find it to be a default posture that we can all embrace without any kind of work. I think it is an ethical demand on us, and it requires a lot of energy to attempt to stay in the way of the yes. And so in these various registers, I've tried to think about what it might mean to continue to say yes in this kind of anti-Black, anti-queer, transphobic, classist, elitist world. I will end there because I feel like I've thrown a whole lot at the wall, like pasta, and trying to see if anything sticks. I hope that there was something that resonated, though. And I'm happy to answer questions and be in conversation. Oh, this is another piece in that project, but that's fine.
So, well, thank you, Ashon. That was amazing. I'm sure there's some questions brewing. Let's give a minute for the thoughts to.
Yeah. That's another one behind me. That's another piece from the Yes, Surrender, Bloom practice. Thank you for those kind words. The kind words in the chat, I see them all. I really appreciate them.
So I'll start with two unrelated questions as thoughts settle. One is about the genre of the letter and the epistolary. You know, Nathaniel Mackey is like a big influence in the book, and for him, it's been this super generative, never-ending machine.
Yeah.
So the question, I guess, is around: is it like that for you, or you think the lonely letters are one, you know, or just now it's something else is coming? And the other totally unrelated question has to do with the presence of Afro-pessimism as an important, you know, as a significant movement, quite diametrically opposed to everything you've said tonight. And just what is your mode of negotiation or avoidance of that formation?
Two very what some might say are different questions. I don't think they're actually that different, honestly. I think that what the letter is a call toward is relation. Um, the letter is not sent out without the desire for it to be read and engaged, even if that engagement is a certain kind of refusal. You know, I talk in the intro of the lonely letters that they started primarily because there's, you know, this person I was writing emails to, not long emails like the ones that are long, that would be ridiculous. But I was writing sort of shortest emails to a couple, like maybe two or three, and they didn't respond. And so I had all this stuff that I wanted to say about music and the church and queerness and things that I wanted to think through. And so I started writing the letters to a mythical character named Moth. Um, but the if call it, if we'll call it something like a project, it was initiated by the desire for relation. And so I think that, you know, one of the things that I try to make clear in the lonely letters is that I am not in agreement with a kind of understanding of Black life as social death, um, which is sort of predicated upon Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death. I just think that it is a very specific understanding of the world that Patterson is working through. And I think that it is a very, I mean, it's not an unreal world that he is working through, but he's speaking about a very specific kind of juridical apparatus that produces and interrupts the capacity to be in relation. And insofar as he is talking about a juridical practice of personhood, then certainly I think that the idea that these people are socially dead is one that is worth thinking with. But for me, it's like that's not the only world that is available. And one of the things that A constantly says in the lonely letters is that there are worlds, plural, and he's trying to talk about the way that we exist in multiple worlds at the same time, such that we actually interrupt a kind of normative understanding of space and time. And so for me, it's, you know, it's like I understand, and I don't think I'm antagonistic to the idea that the way Black life is constituted according to the normative understanding of like ontology is sort of outside of the capacity to be understood by ontology. I just think that I have a different aim in my work insofar as I'm deeply invested in relationship. And I say this as a person who's never been in what we call a sort of normative relationship with anyone. Like I'm still deeply invested in our capacity to be in relation because I think it's a deeply generative thing. And I'm interested in the intramural that Hortense Spillers talks about, which is an internal kind of relation that is made possible through struggle. The intramural isn't a natural disposition. It's not a biological disposition. It is a disposition that people take up because they want to inhabit the same epistemology. And so if people can commit to the epistemology of the intramural, it cannot be a biological fact. And so for me, trying to really think about how can we practice relation with one another seems to me to, it's not about the avoidance of Afro-pessimism. I just think it is a different kind of politics of the understanding of personhood and Blackness too. I don't think that Blackness is the creation of white supremacy. I think that Blackness is the thing that white supremacy attempts to control. So Blackness is a thing that exists prior to white supremacy. It's the thing that exists prior to political ontology. It is a set of relations and practices. And so for me, that's I'm thinking about the priorness of Blackness, not as a biological or biogenic fact. And so when I'm talking about the priorness of Blackness as the practices of the intramural relation, I'm talking about people that were like literally not speaking the same language on ships and like literally working out ways to be with one another. And it's not, the duress of being on the ship is not the thing that created the occasion for their epistemology to say, I can work with you. Because we're all in duress right now, and there's a whole bunch of us that ain't trying to work with one another. And so duress is not the thing, or it isn't the epistemological creation. There has to be a kind of desired worldview that the moment of duress allows you to express a capacity for relation that the crisis of 1492 and its antecedents allows you to express and practice, but I don't think it is a kind of capacity for relation that is created by this epistemology. So yeah, I think that I'm thinking about relation very deeply in the letter form, and I think that it's an attempt to think differently about Blackness and personhood. Yeah.
Any other questions? Put them in the chat or the Q&A.
I know I've exhausted everyone.
I guess we have.
I think there is a hand. I think.
Yeah. So Carrie Blanche wrote, "Experiencing yes describes an intergenerational back and forth dialogue. Do you see the continuation of yes manifesting?" Seems like the question dropped off there.
Can you ask that one more time?
It just seems that maybe she didn't finish typing at the end of the. So Carrie, maybe you can plug back in and. Actually, can I confess that I don't know how to do this raised hand thing?
I see someone's hand raised. It's Eduj Errol Sinead.
All right, so
there is a recording of the Yes Lord project, and I will link you to. Oh, I should say, if you're in LA, you should go to this place called Bridge Projects, which is this gallery space that has an exhibit that's titled Otherwise Revival. And Otherwise Revival is an attempt to think with Black spirituality, specifically Black Pentecostalism. And so all of the artists are responding to, or most of the artists are responding to concepts of Blackness and spirituality. Thank you for saying that, because I wouldn't have figured that out, Melissa. But let me just finish real quick, Eduj. The show is trying to think about Black spirituality, and in its attempt to think about Black spirituality, it has a bunch of stuff, and it's currently in Los Angeles. Bridge Projects is hosting the Yes Lord performance. They're showing it every day at 4 p.m. Central. I'm sorry, not Central, 4 p.m. Pacific time, and they are also showing on loop the entire Yes Lord Paradise remix of Christina McPhee. And also, Christina McPhee, who's in our audience, thank you for being here, also has, I think it's 2 visual pieces that are in the Otherwise Revival show. I have 2 visual pieces that are in the Otherwise Revival show as well. And so you can listen to the entire Yes Lord performance by scrolling down on the page that I just linked to. The entire thing is there. And so I think now we can have the question.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So, I mean, I think the thread that I find in all your work, both the writing and the art and the music, is that there's this very haunting presence that seems to hold the capacity to be simultaneously complex and simple. It's sort of like this Zen that's really deeply informed by both your Blackness and queerness, and they simultaneously are both together and separate.
Yeah.
And it moved me so much because it brings like this incredible amount of peace, especially as a Black queer person, but it also brings a certain amount of uplift and excitement, and it's that idea of saying yes all the time. And I just was so moved by that, and I was moved by the idea that you could find Wright, who's such a composer that is so abstract for some people, and you could ground him and bring him down to earth, right? And I mean, I love him as much as I love Phil Glass, and you were able to put this overlay over it that completely, that manifested what it originally meant, but built on that in a way that was completely unique to you. And, I just wanted to say bravo to that. It wasn't really that, it's not really that I have a question. I mean, because I sort of feel like that just it's an implication of the work that you're doing as a human being in terms of trying to find yourself and find us simultaneously. And I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit. It's not so much a question, but it's more of an exploration of how that came into being.
I can talk about, I was a graduate student at Duke University at the time. I think it was 2010 or 2011. I was taking a course with Fred Booten, who was then teaching there. And I remember him mentioning this song called Music for 18 Musicians by Steve Reich. And I went on my Spotify and downloaded it because Moulton is the kind of person that when he says, "Oh, you should listen to this," I just download it. And I remember listening to it and thinking, it's nothing, like, whatever. What is this repetition? And literally, it was like, it must have been like 2009 when I had first arrived to Duke, or maybe 2010 when I was sitting in on a course with him. And 2011, years went by. 2017, it was Black Friday, and I typically have Thanksgiving with my best friend who lives in Danville, Virginia. And I was driving from Danville, Virginia back to Durham, North Carolina. And one of, I think it was Movement 8 or Movement 9 of Music for 18 Musicians, the None Such recording, I think it's like 1998, came on Shuffle Play. And I was like, oh, I haven't heard this in a long time, literally. And I said, let's listen to the whole thing. And listened to the whole thing, got to Movement 11 and started crying. And I was like, I don't know what's wrong with me, but I felt open to Music for 18 Musicians in a way that I wasn't however many years previous to that. And so I started listening to it pretty obsessively, or let's say pretty consistently. Would listen to the entire recording like once a day from that moment forward. And at that point, I hadn't written anything about it, wasn't trying to write anything about it. But I kept really, really listening to it and listening into it. And I kept feeling moved by it. And so when I decided to collect the letters that were already written into this thing called the Lonely Letters, and I started writing new letters, I decided to write a letter about Music for 18 Musicians. And I remember in 2019, yes. So right before pandemic time, y'all, I was driving from Charlottesville. No, I was driving from Silver Spring, Maryland, where my brother lives, to back to Charlottesville, and I was listening to Music for 18 Musicians, the original recording. And I remember Movement 8 came on, and I started singing "Yes, Lord." Like that's where it came. It kind of happened. Because at first I started doing like this church clap to it, doing a rhythmic church clap to, I think, Movement 11, and saying like, oh, what would it sound like to have like a choir clapping? But like it didn't dawn on me to have like a choir clapping while also singing. And so once I was in the car and thinking about it, sort of, and listening to it, I started singing "Yes, Lord," and that's where the idea to singing came from. And I downloaded Pro Tools in November or early December of 2019, and I started recording. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know if it was going to make sense to anybody else, but I kept just working on it, and it felt like it was Steve Reich talks about listening to a Pentecostal preacher on the street corner, which is why he did one of his first recordings. And so for me, it's like, Reich has always had this relationship to Black Pentecostalism. He understood the repetition. And so for me, Music for 18 Musicians, what I was trying to do in Yes, Lord is to show that there is a Black Pentecostalness that is already there, and that I was able to hear or able to sense something that might not have been apparent, but that is already there. And so for me, it feels like the Yes and the Yes, Lord and the sound of the Hammond organ really, like, now that I hear it, I'm like, yeah, it don't make sense that it was never not there for me. And the hope is that, this was supposed to be live, but COVID, the hope is that we'll do this live with 9 singers with a Hammond organist and with a orchestra as well. So that's where it came from. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So there's 2 questions, and maybe we close it out with this, but I think they're kind of related. The first one is Carrie's, which I think I just misread. It said, experiencing yes describes an intergenerational back and forth dialogue. How do you see the continuation of yes manifesting? And then the other question, which I think might be related, is there any, this is from Annie Garland. It says, is there any acceptance of your work within the Black Pentecostal church in which you grew up?
No. I don't like, it's complicated. Okay, so how do I see the continuation of yes manifesting? I see it, a dear friend of mine sent me a message this week saying that otherwise possibility as a concept, they're not an academic, but otherwise possibility as a concept allowed them to say yes to Black queerness, literally. And like, honestly, that's like, it's better than any award, literally, because this person said that they feel more open and that more is possible in terms of their living. And that's, for me, what the point of any of this is to really incite our imagination toward what else might be possible in terms of like justice and joy, and to, after inciting our imagination, attempting to live into those things that we have imagined as possible. And so I sense the continuation of yes manifesting in all kinds of ways, in ways that have nothing to do with me, and that have everything to do with people just saying yes, and I'm just like able to like sense it there and like write about it or sense it here. I think that you know, in this essay that I wrote about saying yes, it's like Black trans people walking down the street is a literal saying yes in a such a deeply homophobic and transphobic world. That is the yes. And just personally, like me still wanting to have anything along the lines of what we might call a relationship is a saying yes. It is the manifestation of a yes, because there has been so much that has conspired against my own happiness and my own joy. And the attempt to still say yes, I think yes is a restiveness. I think it is the posture of relationality. And so it feels very much like this might be what it means to live a human life. The reason why we say no so much is because the world is so violent to those of us that attempt to say yes. Like, that's like, I think of Blackness as the acceptance of fragility, as like our creatureliness. Like, it is not the attempt to like contend against the fact that we are fragile. It is the acceptance of fragility and the service of being in relation with one another so that we can have a joyful life while we are here in our fragility. That's what Blackness is to me. And so it's like, to live a life within that is to say yes. I think it's constantly happening. And is there acceptance of the work within the Black Pentecostal church that I grew up in? That's complicated for a lot of different, like, my parents are no longer a part of the specific church in which I grew up, and I am agnostic, and I don't attend my parents' church when I'm like home. My parents have experienced some of my work. There was a premiere of the Yes Lord project, and they both zoomed in for that. I curated a sound show in Los Angeles in 2017 before I moved, that was titled Antiphony Otherwise, which was about the sound of the Hammond organ and the smell of food in church. And my mother came to that. And I curated another one in 2019 at Yale University, and both of my parents came to that. that's not my church, but those are like church folks. And so I think that there's some people who I have been in relations since I was a young person who are trying to figure out in a non-paternalistic and charitable way the things that I'm trying to talk about and write about in the life that I'm trying to live. And then there are a lot of people that are really dismissive and don't really talk to me. The last church that I was a member of in Philadelphia before I moved and went to seminary, most of the people there, it's a pretty big church, and I was the director of the youth gospel choir. And one of the musicians at the church, the pastor refuses to speak to me. I mean, I'm not like emailing every day and trying to talk, but refuses to speak to me. And most of the clergy there refuse to speak to me. And most of the members there, they all think I'm, abominable and reprobate and, going to hell. And so I think, but I still do this work because there are queer kids there that need to know that they can say yes to, and that there's life on the other side. And so I try to make the work available, even though a lot of people are mean.
Well, I think we could end there, and want to thank you, Ashon, for such a great talk and for taking time for discussion afterwards.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. That's it.
Thanks, y'all. I really appreciate it.
We appreciate you.